How many of you have seen the documentary Shiny Happy People? Oh my gosh, you guys, homework for this week. Shiny Happy People. Shiny Happy People is it on Prime or Netflix? Anybody remember? You'll have to find out. If you need the password, let me know. Just kidding. I'm just kidding. Big internet. But Shiny Happy People is a docuseries that came out last year, and it examines the evangelical Christianity that children of the 90s grew up with. I am a child of the 90s. So it was very familiar to me, where it's a sort of very conservative, lots of homeschooling, do the right thing, wear long dresses, don't attract the gaze of men type of Christianity that a lot of girls my age grew up with. Some of the women who are close to my age in our congregation probably are familiar with that type of Christianity. It was a bit in the soup, right? So Stephanie's giving thumbs up. And that type of Christianity prioritized women who behaved in a certain way. And if you've seen Shiny Happy People, or if you have been part of a tradition like the one that it is profiling, you will be familiar with today's Hebrew Bible reading before we even read it. And if you haven't seen it, it's your homework for the week. Our Hebrew Bible lesson today comes from Proverbs chapter 31, verses 10 through 31. This is often called the ode to the capable wife, or the ode to the valorous woman. And if you look in our Pew Bible, it's on page 613. Our editors label it Ode to a Capable Wife. Listen now and see if you hear some word from God. A capable wife who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ship of the merchant. She always brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hands to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her household when it snows, for all of her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known at the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her workers praise her in the city gates. Proverbs 31, Proverbs 31, 10 through 31, has come to represent, in many Christian circles in America, what a perfect or idealized Christian woman should be. This text, which we just read. It has now become a nearly impossible standard for women aspiring to be trad wives. Anybody know what a trad wife is? Okay, Stephanie, what's a trad wife? Yeah. So there's this whole movement on the internet, if you're on Instagram or Facebook, more Instagram, TikTok, where there are these women who are calling themselves trad wives, traditional wives, and their focus and goal is to live up to the standards set by Proverbs 31. So they live off the land, they raise their own fruits and vegetables and mill their own wheat and make bread every morning for their husband, and they're wearing cute, long, modest clothing, and they have incredible Instagram followers, just incredible. And so they're making money, a lot of them making videos about their life, right? And they're engaged in all of these beautiful, idyllic, wifely things. They make sure that they look really good when their husband comes home from work. They are the trad wives. I am not a trad wife. That doesn't surprise any of you. So, in what has now become a nearly impossible standard set by this text and trad wives on the internet, in this impossible standard that moms who are homeschooling their kids and making bread every morning and then, I don't know, teaching them violin in their, little quartets at home, in this impossible standard being set for women who are just praying that God will give them an engagement ring from the son of a megachurch preacher. Well, it's true. They're out there. They go to college for a Mrs. degree. I did not get my Mrs. degree, only the English one. But there's this whole movement built around the Proverbs 31 woman. And if you look up Proverbs 31 women, you'll find books, self-helps, manuals about how you too can become a Proverbs 31 woman. And if you're a man, you can find books and self-help in tutorials about how to find one. Okay? This is a whole movement in American Christianity. But Proverbs 31 has been, like many of these somewhat famous and occasionally abused texts from the Hebrew Scriptures, removed from her context. It's another example of a Bible editor sticking in a heading ostensibly so that you and I can find what we're looking for really quickly when we're just flipping through Proverbs. But in doing so, the Bible editor has unwittingly created two stories out of what once was one. So several weeks ago now, we had the story of Bathsheba. And if you were here, you probably remember it. Because that story, I told you, had a misleading heading put in by the biblical editors. So if you turn to page 613 in your Old Testament, if you want to, you don't have to, you'll see that there is this heading put in here, Ode to a Capable Wife. But it has cut the story of Proverbs 31 into two sections. Pop quiz for extra credit in the kingdom of heaven. Does anybody know around when these headings started to appear in the Bible? Were chapter and verse numbers always there? No, they weren't. They were added in the Middle Ages. But when we put those chapter and verse numbers in, and when we start to put headings in, we start to read only the sections that the headings label. In this case, part 1 and part 2 have been separated, and so we don't read part 1. I don't know why the lectionary editors didn't put the whole chapter in, but they don't. But because of that, there are some things that we are missing. And because of that, we're creating this ridiculous standard for what it looks like to be a good wife, or to have a good wife, or to be a good woman, or however we want to translate that. I'm not sure that this is actually intended to be a checklist for trad wives, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, the word translated as wife in verse 10, do you see that? A capable wife who can find? That's how the NRSV editors translate it. In Hebrew, The word for woman is the same as the word for wife, Sept. There is no word for wife, really, or there is no word for woman. It's the same word. So if you were to look up a bunch of different translations of this text, you would find that some translate it a valorous woman who can find. Some translate it like this one, a capable wife, wife and woman. It's the same word. So now I'm like, well, hell, were we supposed to get an example of how to be a woman or a wife? Because they're kind of different in our language, right? The other thing that we miss by reading the English, but which you can kind of start to tell something's going on with if you read a bunch of English translations, is this word capable. The word capable or valorous or strong or mighty, chayil, eshet chayil, what that word really refers to is military might. And if we go back and read the whole section together, instead of just chopping into the second half, we'll see that word again. So if you go back to the beginning of 31, where this story actually starts, we get a different picture. What is actually at the beginning of this story is wisdom given to King Lemuel from his mother. And here's what it says. Now think, mom to son, son's a king. This is her wisdom. No, my son, no son of my womb, no son of my vows, do not give your strength to women, your ways to those who destroy kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, or for rulers to desire strong drink, or else they will drink and forget what has been decreed, and will pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to one who is perishing, and wine to those in bitter distress. Let them drink and forget their poverty, and remember their misery no more. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of all the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and needy. A capable woman who can find. This story, which we, and I don't necessarily mean we Presbyterians sitting in Enid, Oklahoma, but we as a culture of Christians in America have made into a checklist of what it looks like to be a good wife. The very beginning of this story starts with a warning to her son not to fall for a woman. It doesn't start with, listen, my son, to what you should look for in a wife. It starts with, listen, son of my womb, listen, my son, the answer to my prayers, do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings. When you read this in context, it becomes a different thing. When you read it in context, it has me wondering, is this actually supposed to be a list of what it looks like to be a valorous woman? Or is this an impossible list of traits that this mama's boy should look for to make sure he never leaves her? We all probably know that one mom who'd rather have her son stay home and live with her forever than get married and leave. Anybody know one of those? Yeah, right? I wonder if that's what Lemuel's mom was like. She's like, I'll give you a list of what to look for. Good luck finding it. So when we read it in context, there's a little more to this story. So it's a weird text. It appears in our lectionary every 2 or 3 years at this time of year. And usually I try to preach about Katie Luther, the amazing woman who actually ran the Reformation, who made sure that Martin Luther had enough money to actually do his writings. But today I wanted to look at some of that context. So the first thing is, the word for wife is not wife, it's woman. So take it however you want it. The second is that word that we translate as capable in this version, or valiant, or whatever, chayil, really refers to military might and strength. In fact, when Ben-Gurion made the modern Hebrew language, right, because Hebrew, did you guys know Hebrew died out as a language? So when the state of Israel was founded and they wanted to have Hebrew as a language instead of Yiddish, they had to decide what modern words would be. The word for soldier, an Israeli soldier, is chayil. The same word is in this text. And the other place it appears is at the beginning of this chapter when it talks about strength. Don't give your strength, don't give your military might to a woman. Okay, so that's some context there. So next time you see some beautiful coloring page about how you should be a perfect trad wife because of Psalm 31, I just want it to be complicated for you, okay? Or if you're out there looking for a wife, think about whether this is really possible. The other thing about this woman, which we tend to ignore in those circles, is that this is an impossible standard. This woman has enough money to go buy fields, has enough time to go do all the work, has enough time to never let her light go out at night. I mean, God, the woman must be exhausted. But thank God she has hired help, right? This is not a realistic standard to set for young women or old women or any women or men looking for women or women looking for women in our culture, okay? So what the hell does it have to do with us? I wanted to spend a few minutes in this story before we looked at the gospel. Because I think in our culture, especially for those of us who are younger, but I bet it applies to all of us, we grow up unwittingly with these stories about what it looks like to be a good Christian. Anybody have some idea in their head about what it looks like to be a good Christian? Especially what it looks like to be a good Christian wife or husband. And it usually involves some version of this: working yourself until you can't work anymore, being perfect and beautiful and lovely and polite and always conforming to the expectations of the people around you, right? Making sure you're dressed right and speak right and are polite and don't hurt people's feelings. Those are some expectations many of us have when we show up at church or when we speak as Christians or about Christians, right? And it comes from places like this, but I wanted us to think about this and those expectations we give each other and ourselves in conversation with our gospel for today. Jesus is walking along the road with his disciples, and he can tell they're having some dumb argument, and he turns around and he asks, "What are you guys talking about?" But they're silent, for on the way they'd argued with one another about who was the greatest. Now, if they're having an argument about who's the greatest, there must be some checklist, right? There must be some criteria they are using to decide who is the greatest of the disciples. I don't know if it looked like the checklist for Psalms 31 woman, but it's probably something like that, right? Like who does the most work for Jesus, who converts the most people, who brings the most friends to church, whatever it is. They have some list, these disciples, that they're arguing with each other about who is the greatest. And he sits them down and sits them down and says, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." And then he takes a little child, and I don't know if the child's 2 and can almost tell jokes, or if it's a baby, or if it's 7 or whatever. But he takes a child and he puts it among them and says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Now, what do we know about children that's different from adults, like the men who are arguing about who's the best, or the woman who's giving advice to her son, or the woman theoretically described in Proverbs 31? What's the difference between children and grown-ups? One difference is that little children don't have a checklist of what it looks like to act right. They don't have a frame for determining who's better than the other. They don't have all the rules we've inherited from our parents and grandparents and culture about how we ought to act. They don't have the checklist of the Proverbs 31 woman. They just are. They're messy. They're loud. They're cantankerous. They have temper tantrums. Sometimes they bite. They throw toys. They are absolutely exhausting. And they are not bound by the cultural expectations that we've placed on them yet. I wonder when Jesus says, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me," in response to the disciples arguing about who is best amongst them, I wonder what type of community he's really encouraging us to cultivate. Now, lots of scholars will write about how children in those days were basically considered property, right? Children had no rights. They only had as much value as the work you could get them to do. They are as good as property. But he's saying they are the most important. These, the least valued, the least important, the least culturally sensitive, the least appropriate, the least well-dressed, the least well-behaved, they are the ones we need to welcome. I think it presents a challenge for us as church people about how we create church that welcomes kids and people who are different, people who don't follow the rules, people who don't look like the woman from the second half of Proverbs 31. But I think it also might be a challenge about how we love ourselves. Are we holding ourselves up to an unrealistic expectation of what it looks like to be a good woman or a good man? Are we holding the loved ones in our lives up to an unrealistic expectation about what it means to be good or worthy or valuable? Are we trying to make sure that we or our loved ones are considered the best? Because from this, it sounds like it's okay however they act, God loves them. This week, I invite you to think about the complicated stories you've been told about what it looks like to be good, what it looks like to be valorous, what it looks like to be honorable. Whatever that story is for you, we've all been handed down a story about who we should be. And most of us have been handed down a culture that tells us we ought to strive to be the best. But our God seems to be telling us here and over in the New Testament that our striving is useless. We don't have to earn God's love. We don't have to earn anyone's love. We can't. So this week, examine the shoulds you've been given and the shoulds you've given others, the shoulds we've made at church or at school or at work or at home. And ask yourself, were some of these only part of a story that I didn't actually have to live up to? And let's figure out which ones we can let go of.